So this video, part 2 with the symbol, is going to be about this symbol, how I created it, and what it represents. Part 2 will be in 2 separate videos. First, I'll discuss some more visual aspects like the font style, the signs used and why I chose them, and use of the symbol. The second video will discuss the more substantive meaning of the symbol, like what I intend for it to represent. Alright, let's go. 96 countries, 4.6 billion people, represented by 8 currency signs to spell the word equality. The rupee, the euro when you turn it, the cent when you turn it, the yuan, the franc if you flip it, the dollar with the vertical line representing the I, the taka, and the yen. All the countries they represent are listed on the iforwe.org webpage if you're interested. So it actually took me years to finalize the symbol, in part because I was working on it intermittently through a couple master's programs, then working for the government as a labor economist, then in a PhD program that I left early. Life was just happening. But first, in regards to the currency signs, I chose these signs for a few reasons. 1, they lent themselves the ability to spell the word equality. Of all the words out there that would allow for a symbol to be created to represent reducing wealth inequality or equal opportunity for prosperity, the word equality just best fit the intent of what I was trying to accomplish. So I also chose these symbols because I wanted them to represent as many people as possible. So some of these symbols only represent one country, but they're very large countries. Like for instance, the T in equality. I could have chosen the Mongolian Togrog, which would have been far nicer to use because it looks much more like the English capital T. But there are only about less than 4 million people in the country. So instead, I chose the Bangladesh Taka, which looks more like a lowercase t, but represents the 165 million people in Bangladesh. Similarly with the franc, I could have chosen the L for the British pound, but with the franc, though it's not used by France anymore, it's still used in many countries, specifically in Africa, and I definitely wanted to include as many of them as possible.
Go on.
I had to have the Chinese currency symbol, the yuan, in there, as they represent like a fifth of the world's population. I have to use some imagination of that looking like a capital A, but it's possible.
Anything's possible!
Tricky thing about the yuan is it actually isn't the sign generally used in international trading or in foreign exchange. They use a symbol just like the yen, but for the yuan, it is the symbol that's used within the country. Also had to have the rupee for India, another massive country. Slightly had to manipulate that to get it to look like an E, but same thing. Use your imagination. Currency signs also had to be as close to the original as possible. I didn't want to bend them or distort them hardly in any way in order to keep with their original form, which kind of stinks because it would have been far easier to contort them to make the word equality much easier to identify. But that was the rule. I wanted the people represented by these signs to be able to recognize their own sign. As for the font itself, I went through a ridiculous number of fonts. One of the fonts I originally stuck with for a while was intended to be similar to those of luxury brand fonts, like Armani or Gucci. I had the whole website, social media, shirts, etc. made up with this luxury type font. Why? I just thought it gave it style. It was classy, thought it looked nicer than something plain, but after obsessively staring at it, at the font, and trying to figure out what I didn't like about it, I realized that it was too difficult to get each sign to follow any conventions that kept enough consistency among them. So I was trying to keep each sign as close to their original as possible using this fancy font, but it just made the whole thing look too wonky. So I had to simplify it. And that's when I started looking to some of the major international brands like Google, Verizon, Amazon, to realize that they were all using very simple fonts. And I figured they were doing so, and I could be wrong, for one, because the letters were much more easy to identify, much more recognizable by an international audience. If you start putting all these fancy edges and curves on them, they might be more difficult to recognize. And 2, fonts I think can be very suggestive. If you put a fancy font on it, you might be catering to a more wealthy audience. And if you put a more fun, squiggly font on it, you might be catering to a more youthful audience. And I didn't want the font to focus on only one group or the other. I wanted it to represent everyone because that's who the symbol is intended for. So that's what I did. got rid of the fanciness, squared them up. In regards to the thickness of the fonts, if the signs were any thicker, they became too distorted from the original and it just looked too bulky. And similarly with the spacing of the signs, the symbols became too cumbersome, I guess you could say, if the signs were too close together. So when spread out, the signs are much more easier to recognize and it doesn't look as messy.
This could not be more perfect if I had planned it myself.
So in regards to the equality symbol itself, so one thing I actually really like about the symbol is it's not easily identifiable. Like most people can't identify the word equality in the symbol, and I love that about it. No, I'm not lying, and I'll explain why. So for one, it means you kind of have to be in the know to know. Kind of the same idea as like the rainbow flag. Like you wouldn't know that that was a flag that represented support for the LGBTQ plus community unless somebody told you about it or you read about it, which is typically the case with most symbols, right? You don't become aware of the meaning of a symbol unless you're informed of that meaning.
Obviously.
So what's unusual about this symbol is it's a word, and typically symbols aren't words. Like they might be a letter, but this is a symbol made up of other symbols that form a word.
Anyway, so
as I was saying, totally fine with this symbol not being easily identifiable. You don't have to recognize it as the word equality, but hopefully someday you'll recognize it as a symbol supporting equal opportunity for prosperity.
Maybe no.
Now the other and more important reason that I like that it's not recognizable as the word equality is because its unrecognizability makes it a catalyst for starting the conversation about equal opportunity for prosperity, which is one of the main intents of this initiative.
What do you mean by that?
Like I found that people will either ask me what the symbol means, which allows the conversation to get started, or they'll be looking at it like they're trying to figure it out, which I will then ask them if that's what they're trying to do, which then also allows the conversation to get started. So whether they're asking me or I'm asking them if they're wanting to ask me, either way, it's getting the ball rolling. And that's what this initiative is all about.
That's what it's all about.
And not just iforwe doing it, but empowering people to do it themselves with the symbol. Like, hey, look at what I got on. Don't you want to know what that means? Or, hey, you know what the symbol means too?
Very nice.
Like if you just have any old word on your shirt, and they're likely not going to ask you about it. Like it's a word. Most people know what words mean, unless you're Michael Scott and use words like short or gruntled.
Everyone here is extremely gruntled.
Actually, gruntled is a word.
I looked it up.
If instead of a word, you're using a symbol that intrigues them, they're more likely to inquire, which then allows you to get the conversation started. That's it for the first video of part 2. The second video of part 2 is going to be the more substantive one, the one discussing the intended meaning of the symbol. Like and subscribe. Thanks.